Hello, thank you everybody for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rossini, our co-host. Chris, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you again, Dr. Paul.
Well, very good. I want to talk about the Fed today. There's some exciting things going on. Things are moving in the gold market, and the stock market just hangs in there. But then we shouldn't be surprised about the stock market staying up, because I think that is the position of the president. He wants the markets to stay up. That's the purpose of the plunge protection team and all the financial administrators in Washington. You can't let the stock market drop or people will get nervous about what's really happening. And they've been pretty successful, but in the last 2 years, the stock market really hasn't been going very much. It's up and down, but it's hanging in there around 2,700. But there are a lot of concerns about what's happening and what would it be like if they hadn't really come to the rescue and really pump it in. Well, I've always argued the market breaks through, just as it did with the Bretton Woods fixing of the gold price at $35 an ounce. Eventually, the market demolished that, and gold has been pretty much free to just go where it has to by the marketplace. But the fixing of interest rates is the big game the Fed plays, and that's what the market's like. Now, fix the rates so the banks get it cheap and the consumer has to pay a lot. And that's the big ripoff that not too many people talk about. But this thing has been going on for quite a while, but I think they're getting very nervous, because I think, Chris, this 6 weeks ago approximately, there was a big event. And I know you remember it well. That was the night or the morning when the refinancing program, the repos, didn't operate. Nobody wanted them. And the Fed had to, as an emergency, activate them themselves. And their argument was, well, yeah, we need to doctor this market up a little bit. The overnight rate went to 10%. And the rule is by the Fed, we have to keep that down around 2 or less. So this was a big deal, and I said, this is no big deal. This is just a little bit of shortage of change that we have here for a day or two, but they're still doing it. And the big argument I find a little bit fascinating is that they're pouring in massive amounts of money. The balance sheet is growing by leaps and bounds. It sort of reminds you of QE, but the establishment says, no, you don't call this QE, that scares people. So call it something else, just the management of the balance sheet. But looks like QE to me, and it looks like things are unwinding to a large degree, and there are points when you get to a managed economy where even their mismanagement, people no longer tolerate it. And I think we're getting close to that. And even though the stock market stays up, I think it's a very fragile situation. I don't believe just printing more money is going to be satisfactory for everybody.
That's right, Dr. Paul. And people around the world are paying attention and are noticing, because the gold price has reflected this desperation on the Fed. And there are foreign central banks that are accumulating gold. And Dr. Paul will pull up a chart a little later. But I'm going to do something that no American is ever supposed to do, and that's put myself in the position of people in foreign nations. So if I'm in another nation, I have these dollars that I see in my wallet, and I look across the ocean and I see in America, and they spend $1 trillion, about more than they pull in, the government, which is pretty irresponsible. And this same country also has 22 trillion in debt, which is very irresponsible. And it has made promises of over 100 trillion to people, whether it's Social Security, Medicare, which is extremely irresponsible. And then to top it off, there's a gaggle of socialists that are trying to become president, promising free everything, healthcare, education, which is insane. So if I'm across the ocean looking at this, the very first thought I think to myself is, where's the nearest gold dealer?
Yeah. This whole idea and principle and temptation to borrow and spend and not worry about it, it's like an infection. It's very infectious, and it has engulfed our whole society. Even though the people who believe in frugality, saving, and planning, and there's a bunch that would like to do it, but the monetary system sort of prevents it from happening. They really get robbed. You take the middle class that sort of just ambles along. They take out the student loans and they pay above market rates for that, more than they should, just like government does, and the government encourages them to do it because the banks make money on this. But what about the credit cards? That's young and old, but the middle class that can't quite keep up, they use their credit cards. Credit card interest rates of 17%. That's closer to a market rate, of what would happen if the money in the banks that would be loaned out for whatever reason was determined by people saving. Interest rates would probably be 3 or 4%, and maybe a risky customer might be 5%, but it wouldn't be 17%. There's a lot of risk, and the risk is being borne by those people in the middle class. And there's another interesting statistic to show that we're not well prepared for this is doing a polling of the middle class. 1/2 of the middle class claim they do not have money monthly to keep up with their regular bills. So if we think these borrowing efforts are high, they're going to get worse until they stop, and you just can't keep printing money. I always find it fascinating that I remember them talking about it so much in the 70s when we had stagflation. Prices were going up and you had the recession. And the complaint was, we just don't have enough money. They never said the money's not buying enough. They said, we don't have enough money. And that's more or less what they're saying now. There's not enough money to work their repo programs. And they say there's just not enough. There's $1.5 trillion of excess reserves flying out there. They increased the balance sheet by almost $4 trillion, and it's still up to $4 trillion. It's gone back up again since this past month or so. So there's a lot of money there. The one thing they don't have, they have a monopoly on creating money and credit, and they can favor certain groups like the banks and the military-industrial complex. But eventually, it doesn't do exactly what they want. They probably wanted to believe that just pumping the money in there, which was to save the financial system, would also help the average person. It saved the financial system. It's messy though, and right now there's what they've traded off was a mess that they contained by creating a bigger bubble. So in some ways, Trump may have won this political battle. I don't think he's won the economic fight, but there was a disagreement just a few months ago with him and with Powell. But there's not much talk about that. Powell's doing exactly what Trump wants, and I know exactly what must be going through Trump's mind. Can we get this election here soon before the big event occurs? And that's why they will never let up on the Fed. There will be inflation, and it's going to last until the confidence is lost. And that's what we're seeing when we see governments around the world starting to buy more gold, and central bankers, ordinary central bankers talking about, on the rebuilding of this system, we'll probably have to use gold to restore confidence. So that is the case. I do at this time, Chris, want to call attention to what the Germans have been doing. They have been selling gold for 21 years, but this last month they started buying gold. If we could have that chart up, Serkan. Yeah, there we go. See all those lines below the solid line, that's selling gold, which made no sense. I mean, you're supposed to have reserve. But off to the right where the green arrows are, that's their purchase of gold. That is a dramatic change, and that is when the overnight rates soared, to 10%. The Fed came to a rescue. They pretended to be surprised. They shouldn't have been, but maybe they were hoping it wouldn't happen. But Chris, I think this sort of fits into your argument that the central banks of the world are looking at gold again.
That's right, because gold, as we've said many times on the show, it has been money for 6,000 years. That's a long time in human history. But now you're not supposed to even know that. But if you do know that, you're supposed to expect that you live in some kind of advanced magical society where with these PhD people are going to manage money. And we could see what they have done, and the central banks, despite what they say to the public that gold isn't money, they know that it is, and they buy gold for themselves. They hold gold, especially if you look at Russia and China. And even people will remember Dr. Paul asking then Fed Chairman Bernanke, if gold isn't money, why do you hold on to it? Why don't you just sell it? And he said, Bernanke said, tradition. Yeah, right. So they know that when crisis hits, they want to make sure that they have the gold. Everybody else, you'll be stuck with the paper that's losing value and you're buying less and less. But they make sure that they have the money that's been, money for 6,000 years.
Well, I think many countries around the world, not only maybe other central bankers, but all the other governments and the people are getting tired of what we do. Our foreign policy is very annoying by dropping a lot of bombs and pretending we're the policemen of the world. I think that our respectability is definitely dropping. But this has started a while ago. There's been countries that put gold in New York, Fed Bank, and it was held there. This was sort of in the atmosphere of World War II because we were seen much more favorably when we weren't an empire, but we went to a rescue, and that was the beginning of the empire. But they sort of liked us for us, and they trusted us. We weren't going to be invaded. So they put the gold in the banks, the Federal Reserve banks in New York City. And now they're, repatriating. Germany has done this, a large amount of over 600 ounces of, 600 tons of gold they've repatriated back to their country, assuming that they don't want it in New York. But others have done that too, and they've asked for it. As a matter of fact, even Texas is working on a project to try to get gold and silver to be legal tender in the state, but they've been storing some gold and they've had it at the Federal Reserve, and now they're working hard to get it out of the Federal Reserve. So they're probably sort of like these other countries that don't want the gold to be elsewhere. But no, I think it's going to be hard to repatriate. It's going to be hard to get a new currency or restore our currency without the use of gold. And of course, Chris, and I'm sure you recall that when I was in Congress, I worked real hard on this, believing what is happening now would come. And I had proposals that would have made the Constitution legal, and that would have been a gold and silver standard. Mm-hmm. But I never thought that would happen. It was the spending that was the problem. But what I wanted to do was try to get people prepared for this and make sure an alternate currency would be legal. An alternate currency for me right now is the constitutional money of silver and gold, because you're not allowed to use that as legal tender because the Federal Reserve notes are legal tender. So they didn't do that. But I think the way my bill is written is the market can help decide if they do everything legally and no fraud. Not only could they legalize gold and silver as a currency, they could use other things. If they find out that there is cryptocurrencies or things that work, they ought to be able to do this. And whether or not a law gets passed like that, that's more or less what happens when a society collapses. There's always something used as money. I'll bet there's been hidden dollars and commodities and gold and silver, all sorts of things in places like Venezuela and Zimbabwe and the South American countries. No, after war, generally they will find some type of something, a commodity that they can use. And I just want to make sure that people realize that we need to change things to make sure it's absolutely legal. But when there's total chaos, it's sort of like what happened on the Bretton Woods when it became chaotic trying to fix rates with gold at $35 an ounce. It wasn't working, and people had to prepare, and that finally happened. And I think we're in the midst now of the early stages of major changes. And I believe this is a reflection of our foreign policy, the deficits that we're running up, the $1 trillion a year that we're spending. And I always had a saying about this, that when they would ask me about taxes, should we raise or lower taxes, and which tax should we do, how should we collect the revenues we need? But I may always try to make a point that spending is the tax. Because if government's spending $1 trillion that they don't have, if they're going to have an income tax go up to pay it, it's not going to work. People don't have it, and so they run up the debt. So what do? They borrow money, but then people don't want to borrow the money. Interest rates go high. And then they start printing the money, and it always hurts the middle class. All this mischief. And they say, well, the middle class doesn't really pay a whole lot of income taxes, but they suffer the consequences of inflation and distortion and loss of jobs. The best example of this, Chris, I'm sure we could use as a point, what happened during the big depression, recession here in 07, 08. The middle class wasn't rescued. They didn't get the bailout.
No, they didn't. And I'd like to close, Dr. Paul, I'd like to credit Peter Schiff for this because he brought it to my attention on Twitter. There was a statistic that came out, maybe our viewers saw it, that 50% of American workers today are earning less than $33,000 per year. And Peter pointed out that that's about 22 ounces of gold per year. That's what an American is earning before taxes. Now, over 100 years ago, Peter points out, without any government mandates, minimum wages, labor unions, or taxes, Henry Ford was paying his factory line workers 65 ounces of gold per year, tax-free. So that means that in real money, from 100 years ago to today, real money like gold that retains its purchasing power, factory workers made triple what the average American makes today with the biggest government on earth, with college degrees. This is what they have done to America. They bled it dry. And, it doesn't take a PhD to understand that gold is money. And Americans that lived before us lived pretty well and were paid pretty well without all this government intervention.
Very good, and I'm going to close by reemphasizing the things that I talk about so much, and that is, why does this happen? Well, people want a free lunch, and they think they can get it by this mystical method of monetizing debt and printing money and undermining exactly the system that you were talking about. But it is a political problem because people like it, and they know that they have to keep it going. That means more borrowing and spending. You can't just wean people off. It won't happen. We should try and make the point. But it is a political thing in the sense that both parties want to ignore it. They fight like cats and dogs. But how many presidential candidates right now, and we'll include the president in this, and all the Democrats, how many are saying, we ought to get our fiscal house in order? Don't you think we ought to cut back a little bit? Don't you think we're overspending? Don't you think we're overprinting money? And don't you think the Federal Reserve has too much power? Don't you think the FBI and the CIA has too much power? What should the role of government be? Well, how do you know what it's supposed to be? Well, if you're really confused, we're supposed to read the Constitution, and they give us a pretty good outline, which we totally ignore. But how many people are mentioning that in the presidential race right now? Nobody's talking about that. They're talking about if a Democratic candidate offers some program, it's sort of like bidding. The next guy comes along and says, I can do better than that. Not only will I pay for all that, I'm going to give them all this too. How are you going to pay for it? Well, we won't worry about that. We have this modern monetary theory that uses the Federal Reserve like this is a new idea. They just print the money and everything will be okay, and we'll make sure that poor people get the money, and we will destroy anybody who earned their money and they happen to be rich, because being rich is so evil unless you're, according to them, a politician yourself. But anyway, I think our problems are very, very serious. I think there's something major coming on politically in our foreign policy and monetary policy. I don't think it's complex. I think the answers are rather clear-cut. I think the founders understood the best system ever offered before, but I think the American people have forgotten it. And if we want to spread American goodness around the world, it shouldn't be with blood and guns and all this thing and fiat money. It should be by getting our house in order and setting a good example for other people. Instead of forcing us on other people and pretending that we know what's best for everybody, we should set an example. And I believe that what would result is we'd have more peace and more prosperity. Not a perfect society, that's not possible, but it would be a lot better than what's coming. And that's what we have to offer. And we'll have a chance to do this because I think we're going to further lose the credibility around the world, both in being the kingpin financially and militarily and in charge of the reserve currency of the world. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.